Warm greetings. Let's review a case of deep vein thrombosis. As we know, venous thromboembolisms are basically clot formations in the venous circulation that could manifest as a deep vein thrombosis or a rather complication, pulmonary embolism. Unfortunately, the disease is often clinically silent, and that's why the first manifestation could just be sudden death. It is estimated that the disease has an annual incidence of more than 600,000, and the symptoms being so non-specific, it's important that the case is handled diligently and within the time constraints. So let's review the case and analyze the situation accordingly. Here we have an individual named Mr. LN, a 76-year-old obese man who was admitted to the hospital 3 days ago for management of recurrent angina. He was started on a nitroglycerin drip and confined to bed rest with gradual increases in his oral anti-anginal medications. So on the right side, we can see our beloved Mr. Ellen, weighing 92 kgs and 6 feet tall, admitted to the hospital and being managed. On the third day of hospitalization, he noted progressive swelling and soreness of the right calf. He denied any shortness of breath, cough, or chest pain. What you might have noticed here is, even though the symptoms are actually restricted to just the right calf, there is a special questionnaire asked for any respiratory distress. It's because even if there is a minimal clue or just a clinical suspicion of deep vein thrombosis, we have to rule out pulmonary embolism first because it is life-threatening and every minute counts. So a medical history was taken and Mr. Ellen was found to have had coronary artery disease, myocardial infarctions at the age of 55 and 67, and a known case of hypercholesterolemia. He is on the relevant medicine for as long as he can remember and relatively adherent. Baseline laboratory values of the platelet count, hematocrit, basically the integrity of the clotting process is being taken just to, have a standard to compare with that will be used in monitoring both the therapeutic and the adverse effects of the anticoagulant therapy that we will initiate. Apart from that, even baseline renal function is essential because some anticoagulants are renally eliminated. Now that we have assimilated all the background data on Mr. Ellen, let's look at the case from a healthcare professional's perspective and evaluate accordingly. So we will understand what we're supposed to know before the diagnosis, during the diagnosis, after, and then the follow-up. Let's get into before the diagnosis. The first question that should come to our mind is, what signs and symptoms does Mr. Ellen demonstrate that are consistent with DVT? Generally speaking, more often than not, almost half of the patients do not show any symptoms, so asymptomatic, and that's why this disease is very dangerous. But on the other hand, a lot of people come with unilateral leg swelling, which is relatively sudden. When the physical examination is done at the limb that is responsible for the symptoms, a cord-like entity is felt that is significantly palpable and tender. It is suggestive of DVT, but it's not seen always. Discoloration of the affected limb is also one of the factors that could associate with deep vein thrombosis. For example, if there is a venous obstruction, then we can expect the limb to look a little cyanotic, or the skin could have a little bit of pallor if there is an arterial spasm undergoing beneath. But our Mr. Ellen presented with the sudden onset of unilateral swelling along with mild soreness, but there was no cord-like entity or any other symptoms. The next question we're supposed to ask ourselves is about the etiology of the disease. Especially in cases like deep vein thrombosis, a very detailed history can be truly helpful in diagnosing the condition. So what risk factors does Mr. Ellen exhibit that are associated with DVT? To understand this, be certain of understanding the Virchow's triad. I am going to emphasize a little about this. So basically, in the late 1800s, there was a German pathologist called Dr. Rudolf Virchow who was responsible for understanding the effect of clotting and how the blood vessels and blood played a part in it. And that's why there are 3 basic mechanisms according to which a deep vein thrombosis can begin in the body and can contribute to thrombosis. So the first one is hypercoagulability. It's basically the blood is supposed to be in liquid form always, like in the body. When it comes outside, it gets coagulable. But that's not relevant here. What's relevant here is that coagulability is happening inside the body, and that's not right. It's basically your milk is turning into a thick shake, and we don't want that because that's inviting trouble. There are various factors that could cause hypercoagulability, and we have to verify this with every patient that we are expecting with DVT. That's because it can add up to the diagnosis, and it can explain to us that for how long do we expect the patient to be on the treatment. So factors that could attribute to hypercoagulability are cancer, estrogen use, if the patient has a family history of diseases that could suggest hypercoagulability, sepsis, heparin-induced thrombocytopenia, antithrombin deficiency, advanced protein C resistance. So protein C, protein S, and antithrombin are basically inherently present anticoagulants. So if you have a deficiency or a resistance of that, you will obviously have more coagulable state. And certain autoimmune disorders that have a positive titer for antiphospholipid antibodies like lupus can also present with DVT. So if we know, like if we have a lady, Mrs. FQ, who came in and she has a history of cancer and is on hormone therapy, we can suspect, and plus she shows symptoms of a limb swelling that is unilateral, we can have a certain clinical suspicion of DVT and start management immediately. I would like to underscore the importance of estrogen here. So if there is one drug or if there is one medicine that is responsible for causing deep vein thrombosis, it is estrogen. So if a patient comes and is on estrogen and is showing certain symptoms that could deviate towards DVT, you are supposed to, it's supposed to alarm in your head that, oh, it can be DVT. The next factor that can contribute to thrombosis is hemodynamic changes, that is stasis, or if there's a turbulence. The various factors that are included in this are advancing age or immobilization, cord injury, heart or lung failure, hyperviscosity, obesity, and stroke. So we can see our beloved Mr. Ellen certainly has hemodynamic changes that could contribute to DVT because there has been rest advised to him since he was hospitalized. So immobilization, advancing age, yes, he is 76 years old, and the last thing, obesity, 92 kgs. Look what you've done to yourself, Mr. Ellen. Finally, the last risk factor that could be a contributor to thrombosis is endothelial injury or endothelial dysfunction. That can happen in various extrinsic as well as intrinsic mechanisms. They are if there is a surgery or if there is a history of prior DVT, or even if venous access is being given to the patient, trauma or sepsis. So to answer the question, Mr. Ellen has presented with obesity and immobilization, that is prolonged bed rest, that could have led to the disease. Now that we are certain about what could have caused it, let's correctly diagnose the condition and be sure it is deep vein thrombosis. So how should the final diagnosis of DVT be made in Mr. Ellen? After evaluation of the signs and symptoms, consideration of the risk factors. It is very important. Consideration of the risk factors for development of thrombus. A definitive diagnosis is made by other laboratory techniques, and they are, the most common one is duplex scanning. That's the one you're supposed to know. There is B-mode imaging plus Doppler ultrasonography that will show that yes, there is a deep vein thrombosis, in which vein and how much obstruction is there, and further management can be evaluated from that. Apart from that, a D-dimer assay is also appropriate. D-dimer is basically a degradation product of the fibrin clot, and levels of D-dimer are significantly higher in patients with acute thrombosis. So a positive test could be actually attributed to various other conditions because DVT is high in a lot of conditions. But a negative D-dimer or a lesser or normal count can certainly rule out DVT. So it is a good test to be done before entering into invasive procedures to evaluate the condition. Such non-invasive techniques like Doppler ultrasonography plus this could be useful. Moving on, now that we have done the duplex scanning, it reveals a clot formation in Mr. Allen's right calf extending to the right thigh. He does not exhibit signs of PE. What is the appropriate therapy for Mr. Allen and how should it be initiated? So, Congratulations, we have the diagnosis. We know that Mr. Allen has a deep vein thrombosis in his right calf that is extending to his right thigh. I am going to take a minute or two to explain the therapy because it's very important to give prompt and optimal anticoagulant treatment to the patients. In the absence of any contraindications, the treatment of venous thromboembolisms should initially include a rapid acting anticoagulant like unfractionated heparin that we have, or low molecular weight heparin or fondaparinux. Then it is overlapped with warfarin for at least 5 days, and until the patient's INR is greater than 2, anticoagulation therapy should certainly be continued for a minimum of 3 months. So he is hospitalized for the first 5 days where he is monitored and the progress of the thrombus is seen. After that, he is put on warfarin for a minimum of 3 months. The duration of anticoagulation therapy after that is based on the patient's risk of developing another episode of DVT or has had any major bleeding. Antithrombotic therapies require meticulous and systematic monitoring. I will repeat it, and you have to remember it all your life, that antithrombotic therapies require meticulous and systematic monitoring. It cannot be left unchecked. So now that we have all our options available, we have the diagnosis ready. We will start Mr. Allen on intravenous unfractionated heparin because he is currently hospitalized and we can monitor him at that situation. So we will give a loading dose and then we will give a continuous infusion. The loading dose is given so that it has an instant impact, and it will be started on anything between 70 to 100 units per kg, and then a continuous infusion will be given at 15 to 25 units per kg per hour. And since this patient is obese, you have to adjust the dose accordingly. You cannot give it on the actual body weight of the individual. You have to adjust the body weight and then give. And a large initial dose generally is necessary to achieve a therapeutic effect, and that's because a relative amount of resistance to anticoagulation exists when an active clotting process like a thrombus formation is happening in the body. So you need a jolt, an extra jolt of medicine. Apart from that, based on the pharmacokinetic principles, a therapeutic serum level will be achieved more quickly, and that's why therapeutic responses to prevent progression of the clot will also happen rapidly. So there is a double advantage of giving a loading dose followed by continuous infusion. So now that the patient has been put on heparin and is being continuously monitored, we will see what happens during the follow-up. On day 2 of heparin therapy, Mr. Allen's complete blood count comes back and we can see a fall in the platelet count value to 55,000 to 180,000. So that is a definite fall, and this can be termed as thrombocytopenia. And since the patient is on heparin, I know most of you must be knowing that the most common and threatening side effect of heparin is heparin-induced thrombocytopenia. But do we have to worry over here? Let's find out. What is the reasonable explanation for this thrombocytopenia, and how are we supposed to manage it? Are we supposed to cut off heparin immediately and start an alternative treatment? Are we supposed to worry? Are we supposed to check for bleeding? Or are we supposed to sit and watch? Never do that. When it comes to thrombocytopenia with heparin, you're supposed to know that there are 2 different kinds of it. One is heparin associated thrombocytopenia and the other one is heparin induced thrombocytopenia. Of course, everybody knows that HIT is one of the most difficult to manage often sometimes condition, and it is a medical emergency, whereas HAT, that is heparin associated thrombocytopenia, is a reversible form of thrombocytopenia that occurs within the first several days of heparin therapy. And how to differentiate between the two is heparin associated thrombocytopenia certainly does not cause the fall of platelets by more than 50%. So if it's 100,000, maybe it will be 80,000, but it will not go to 40,000 or something. If it is going that low, then it is heparin induced thrombocytopenia. HAT does not cause such a significant fall so soon, and the mechanism between both of them is different. In heparin induced thrombocytopenia, there is presence of antibodies that are causing this, and in HIT it often starts after a few days of heparin treatment. What happens is, in the immune mediated reaction, heparin binds to the IgG antibody to form a heparin antibody complex that binds to the platelets and leads to significant platelet aggregation. So the fall in the count is not because of platelet destruction or bone marrow suppression, it's just the platelets are aggregating a lot and so the count is reduced. But here, in case of Mr. Allen, as we can see that the reduction in platelet count somewhat seems modest and likely represents heparin-associated thrombocytopenia. So we don't have to take any hasty decision of actually stopping the therapy. His platelet count should be monitored on a daily basis, yes, and the heparin therapy should be continued. And we'll see tomorrow what the count is and how the patient is doing. On day 3 of heparin therapy, Mr. Allen's hematocrit has come and it has dropped from 36.5% to 29%, and then there is blood noted in his urine. How would one evaluate this event now? Number one, and the most important thing to know about anticoagulant therapy is bleeding is the most common adverse effect associated with anticoagulant drugs. Hemorrhagic bleeding. A patient's risk of major hemorrhage is related to the intensity and stability of the therapy. Concurrent drug use, history of any other gastrointestinal bleedings, risk of fall, recent surgery or trauma, and age. So these are the certain things that can attribute to the bleeding and they have to be monitored. In the case of Mr. Allen, he has developed hematuria despite an acceptable intensity of anticoagulation. So we are not giving him a heavy dose, we're giving him a fine dose, but still he has developed hematuria. He should be questioned and examined for presence of bleeding anywhere else in the body. Is there any nose bleeding, or does he have an increased tendency to bruise, or does he have bright red blood cells in his stool, or even a black stool? That means it's not bright red. Or is he even just coughing up blood? So any other source of bleeding should be identified and rectified. Blood pressure, standing, sitting, has to be taken. Pulse should be checked. This is a serious condition, so you have to monitor correctly, and a thorough evaluation of the urinary tract has to be done so that we can find out if there is a pathology that was previously present that can be attributed to the condition that has come up right now, or is it because of heparin therapy. After doing all this, we can come to a conclusion what to be done next. So in case of Mr. Allen, thorough monitoring was done. Alternate causes for the bleeding were evaluated and rectified, and he was found stable. The next question that we can ask ourselves is, how long should heparin therapy even be continued in Mr. Allen? Adherence of a thrombus to the vessel wall and subsequent endothelialization usually takes 7 to 10 days. So 7 to 10 days he has to be on heparin therapy. However, anticoagulation therapy must generally go for 3 to 6 months, but that is not heparin. That is converted to another oral anticoagulant that's available. It's warfarin, right? So the patient will be put on warfarin and then evaluated by his PT-INR values on a weekly basis and seen for 3 months. What other side effects of heparin could have happened in this patient or should be evaluated for any future references? The other side effects that we can worry about are the development of osteoporosis, although it has been associated with the administration of more than 20,000 units per day and for as long as 6 months or longer. So for Mr. Allen, it's nothing to worry about. Apart from that, hyperkalemia, although rare, has been attributed to heparin-induced inhibition of aldosterone synthesis. It may occur as quickly as within 7 days after initiation of the therapy and appears to be reversible after the discontinuation. Apart from that, one risk that every drug almost has is a hypersensitivity reaction, and if the patient has that, you cannot give the drug later. So this is the follow-up of the case, and the patient was sent stable at home, and I hope he's doing well. Thank you, Mr. Allen, for this wonderful case and for helping us understand the disease in a more practical approach. So let's end it with the nerdy nub to take away from this case, and that is, number 1, the risk of venous thromboembolisms is related to several identifiable factors including age, immobilization, obesity, or major surgery, previous venous thromboembolisms, trauma, malignancy, and hypercoagulable states. These risks are also additive. So if you have two, the chance of DVT is actually higher. This is one thing you're supposed to remember. Yes. The second thing is prompt and optimal anticoagulant therapy is indicated to minimize thrombus extension and its complications, including pulmonary embolisms. Antithrombotic therapies require meticulous and systematic monitoring. You have to monitor the patient. The third thing to remember from this is, in the absence of any contraindications, how do we initiate the treatment? We start with a rapid-acting anticoagulant like unfractionated heparin or low molecular weight heparin or even fondaparinux. It is overlapped with warfarin for at least 5 days, and I hope you know why. Because the action of warfarin actually is delayed, and it takes approximately 3 to 5 days for it to show a full-blown therapeutic effect. And the INR should come greater than 2, because the therapeutic INR of an anticoagulant, oral anticoagulant, warfarin, is usually between 2 to 3. Anticoagulation therapy should be continued for a minimum of 3 months. The duration of the anticoagulation therapy should be based on the patient's risk of VT, recurrence, or any other major bleeding. The last thing, bleeding is the most common adverse effect associated with anticoagulant drugs. A patient's risk of major hemorrhage is related to the intensity and stability of the therapy, that is the dose you're giving and how rightly you're giving. Concurrent drug use, because warfarin is a very nasty drug and it has a lot of drug interactions that you are supposed to be aware of. History of any gastrointestinal bleeding or risk of falls, especially in the elderly, or any recent surgery or trauma, and age. With this, I will be signing off. Thank you. Yours sincerely, the Nerd.